All right. Well, listen, we're in the wrap-up phase of today's event, and we have an all-star panel, and I'm really excited to get them to weigh in on this. So we're going to bring them on screen one at a time. First off, we have Kevin Page. Kevin, of course, was Canada's first ever parliamentary budget officer, and he is also the current president and CEO of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and Democracy at the University of Ottawa. Welcome to you, Kevin.
Hi, Michael.
Our second panelist is an expert on political Ottawa. Susan Delacourt is an Ottawa-based columnist for the Toronto Star, where she has been covering Parliament Hill for a few years, I'd say. Right, Susan?
Yeah, several.
Okay, several. We'll just call it several.
Yeah.
And our third and final panelist is the chief economist and vice president of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. He's an award-winning business economist specializing in global and technology change. Please welcome Dr. Trevin Stratton from the Canadian Chamber. Hello, Trevin.
Hi, Michael.
Well, once again, it's great to have you here. I'm really eager to dig into this. And Kevin, I think we're going to start off with you. As Hugh was indicating, he asked the minister about this. A budget, by its very nature, is a balance between investment and debt. So, where do you think the government balanced that, Kevin? How did they get it right? Some of the numbers, of course, the deficit numbers are quite shocking. Oh, and we might be oh, there we go. Kevin will check you. Okay. Kevin, unfortunately, we have a challenge with your microphone, so we'll just put you on hold there for a second. I'll go maybe to Trevin, and Trevin, in fact, maybe I'll ask that same question. Kevin, you've got the expertise in economics, so when you take a look at the debt situation balance with investment, what do you think, Trevin?
Well, I think for businesses, there are a lot of things to like in this budget, that were mentioned in some of the previous presentations. Certainly when it comes to, capital investments and the write-off that is available, that's going to be very useful for a number of different businesses. There's a big focus on growth and jobs, which obviously the business community has been asking for. And that includes some big ticket items that are about economic fundamentals, when it comes to the regulatory burden, when it comes to interprovincial trade barriers, when it comes to the National Trade Corridors Fund for trade enabling infrastructure. There are a lot of different announcements in there that should hopefully help with longer term Canadian competitiveness. At the same time, I mean, it's a lot of money. This is a pretty significant budget. There is a lot of spending. It's going to be a relatively large deficit, though still projected to decrease year over year over the next few years. And so what's going to be very important, I think, first of all, is the government's success in shifting the growth drivers from public spending to private sector investment over the longer term. And in terms of actually meeting their deficit projections going forward, in actually being able to meet their growth targets going forward as well, because that's going to have a big impact on government revenues.
Susan, I want to go to you next. Every budget is meaningless unless the government gets it passed, and unless that political party continues to govern, quite frankly. So, again, I just wanted to start off by asking a big level question: did the budget hit the mark from a political perspective?
Well, if we were not in the middle of a pandemic, and hi everybody, thanks for having me here. If we were not in the middle of the third wave of a pandemic, this might well be a budget that the opposition parties would like to use to topple the government and pitch us into an election. I think that's less a function of the content of the budget and more about how antsy people are in the current minority parliament. That being said, we are not going to have an election because of this budget, almost guaranteed. It's dangerous to make predictions in politics, but Jagmeet Singh, the NDP leader, has indicated he will probably support this because he doesn't think it's the time for an election. He's right. So is this an election budget? No, immediately. Yes, in the long term. Liberals are saying that all the things they put in this budget, they're very happy to take to a national campaign. So I think politically, I would be less focused, and I am, I think, less focused on how it clears the House of Commons than to how it clears with all the provinces. because it is much of the contents of this budget are highly dependent on negotiations with the provinces. In fact, I don't think I've seen a budget so dependent on provincial buy-in and support.
And of course, you're talking about childcare there, and I was going to dig into that in just a few minutes. Trevin, I'm going to go back to you, and we'll see if we can't get Kevin's mic problem rectified there. The Canadian Chamber would, of course, done a ton of lobbying in advance of this, and maybe never done such important lobbying to make sure that we've got the right stimulus and support for local and regional and national businesses. Give us a sense, Trevin, on if we got the right stimulus and support levels for business.
So our position has always been that we don't necessarily need short-term stimulus. What we need in the short term is support for those businesses in the hardest hit sectors who have, who can't remain in operation because of the pandemic and the restrictions that have been put in place because they rely so much on physical presence. And so definitely the focus on extending the wage subsidy, the rent subsidy, the creation of the new hiring program is specifically targeted for businesses in those sectors, the hardest hit sectors and small businesses. And that's very much appreciated, and a lot of businesses were looking for that. And we certainly were advocating very strongly for that too. And one of the challenges, or one of the things that the government is going to need to keep in mind, is that certainly there's going to need to be flexibility when it comes to some of those programs too. They can't wind them down too quickly. They can't reduce the amounts that are going out too quickly as well. And they have kind of built in some flexibility there. They're supposed to end around September, but they've said they can potentially extend them to November. And so a lot of that will depend on how the pandemic, the health aspects of the pandemic itself actually transpire. And then, in terms of short-term stimulus spending, there is a lot of money that's in savings accounts right now, and a lot of economists out there are saying that there will be pent-up demand once the economy is able to safely reopen and there's widespread vaccination, and that will really kind of spur short-term growth, and there will be an initial rebound that's going to be very significant in the second half of this year because of that. So that's why we said we didn't need kind of short-term spending to add to that growth. What we needed was short-term supports for those businesses, and then focusing on longer-term economic competitiveness measures to turn that initial rebound into a longer-term economic recovery.
Okay. That's a great comment. Kevin, we're going to try to bring you back here. My fingers are crossed. I see your fingers are crossed. So Kevin, I did want to come back to you and just talk about debt. There was a time when a $35 billion deficit would have been a shocking thing, and now we're 10 times that. Is that level of spending warranted, Kevin? Fingers crossed.
Yeah, so massive increases in debt. Can you hear me, Michael?
We are good. You're great now. Thank you.
So big increases in debt. With those large deficits, $350 billion in 2021, $150 billion this year, declining to about $30-40 billion 5 years out. That debt to GDP ratio, the government's fiscal anchor, goes from about 30%, stays relatively flat at 50%. Can you justify literally a 1 year increase in the debt to GDP ratio of 20 percentage points, where it took us literally more than a decade to get it down that amount through the 90s and early 2000s? I would say only in the context of a global pandemic. And in this context, when you look at what's happening in other countries, large fiscal supports in the US, big increases in deficits and debt, the same in Japan, the same in Australia. Canada is definitely a big spender, like when you look at these IMF comparisons, but it's really on a relative basis. Once we work our way through this crisis, we're still going to have our net debt to GDP numbers are still going to look a lot better than our competitors. And I think hopefully the bond rating people will kind of look at this and say Canada's in a good stead. But it would be nice if we had a stronger fiscal planning framework, some real fiscal anchors and guardrails, which we don't really have in this budget. But so an opportunity for the Conservatives, I think, really to promote, maybe a new way of looking at fiscal responsibility over the medium term.
That's great, Kevin. I'm going to come back to you with a question on that. First, we'll go back to Susan for a second. Susan, when I think about the context that this budget is being presented in, we're in a state of emergency. We're still in Ontario, at least, a stay at home. it must be very difficult for political parties such as the Liberals to have their messages break through, but to have a budget message break through and communicate with people is especially hard. Did the budget have the right measures to break through? Maybe I'll call it the pandemic fog that we're in.
That's a really good question, Michael, and I'm not sure. I think that people are rightly preoccupied right now with way bigger things in their lives, especially here in Ontario, where things are urgent. The government apparently thought about this budget in 3 timelines, and so maybe that's the way we should look at it. One was Victoria Day, as May 24th weekend, when Ontario are things going to be better by then? Is there anything in this budget to get us through to that? I think some of the other panelists have talked about that. The next one is Thanksgiving, when we hope that most of Canadians are vaccinated and that we are starting to talk about recovery. And their third one was something Kevin alluded to, is a 5-year timeline. It's where is Canada going to be in 5 years? And so I think this in normal times would have been a big budget to try to bring out there. We're going to hear a lot about childcare, but then it's going to go away because it's going to have to be negotiated. I'll just sum up by saying I'm sort of thinking in terms of 3 C's right now about this budget. COVID is the first one. The next one is climate. We have a big climate summit with the United States this week, and I think that's where the focus is going to turn. And then the other C is all the cares: home care, long-term care, health care, child care. Those are all things that, as I said, require this government to negotiate with the provinces, and it means that there's no instant solutions to any of those care issues.
Yeah, I think those 3 C's are the right ones that are on people's minds. Trevin, I'm going to come to you. We've referenced a couple of times childcare, and I want to get your economist's perspective on it. So much was made for good reason, by the way, that this was the first federal budget presented by a female finance minister and also a working mom. So I think it's high time that we had a female budget minister, by the way. So as an economist, though, I'm sure you're always looking and urging the federal government to make smart economic investments. And there's been a lot of talk about $10 a day daycare and whether that is a smart investment. What's your perspective as an economist on that, Trevin?
So I think that certainly we agree with the objectives of it, and I think most economists would say the same. I mean, the workforce aspect of it is so important for growing the economy and having a large economic base, and definitely during the pandemic, there are challenges that many women are facing getting back into the workforce that men aren't, at least not at the same level. The question isn't about the objective of childcare itself. I think a lot of people would agree with that. Is this the right way to go about it? And there are certainly different views on that. One thing that I would like to point out is that creating a national program is going to take time, and there are a lot of women that need support right now. And so, how is that going to be resolved is a question as well. And certainly to Susan's points as well, we're going to have to see how the negotiations go with the feds and the provinces going forward too.
Okay. Kevin, I want to come back to you and ask a little bit. I've heard terms like guardrails and fiscal anchors, and maybe you can start off by just explaining why you think those are important, by the way, for today's audience. But I also wanted to get you to comment on effectively the permanent spending built into this federal budget. So we talked about the size of the deficit, and hopefully it will shrink as a portion of GDP. But are you concerned about the permanent spending that we're building in, and whether or not we can pay for this in the long run?
So, Michael, on the permanent spending part of your question, I would say that there's definitely even once we work our way through this COVID period of time that Susan talked about, and we get to the medium term, we have a small, what economists would call a structural deficit. So the economy, we're still running a deficit, even though the economy is operating at trend or full capacity. And it's about 1 percentage point of GDP. obviously a lot of that is probably, or a good part of that would be the childcare program that, that they've set aside, the better part of $10 billion a year in those outer years. I think, so the finance people, and I used to be one, will probably argue that in the context of very low interest rates, higher growth relative to interest rates, that size of structural deficit is not a problem. We could run it. The conservatives may argue that we really don't need that, even a structural deficit. We should be back at zero. And so that's one way of looking at it. In terms of fiscal sustainability, there's analysis gets done at the Parliamentary Budget Office, the IMF. We saw projections in Finance Canada. When you look at the federal structure, revenue spending, even with this much higher debt to GDP ratio, we look sustainable. Debt declines relative to income as you move further and further out from where we are right now. I think when bond rating people look at that, they're well aware that Canada, as a federal government, is fiscally sustainable. Most provinces are not. So we have this intergovernmental fiscal imbalance that I think, again, that was one of the reasons why premiers were saying I need a better part of $30 billion a year. So, I think these issues, anchors and guardrails, I think like Canadians, we saw in the 1990s and early 2000s that if fiscal discipline pays off. Like we saw a significant reduction in debt to GDP ratios from the mid 1990s to, the financial crisis. And we're living in a time, I think the government thinks that the economics of deficits have fundamentally changed. That low interest rates are a game changer and they could just spend. Unfortunately, it's possible. Yeah, with all the stimulus coming from monetary policy and fiscal policy, you can get some instability. And you hear these great economists, Trevin is one, but there's also people like, Summers and others, Blanchard, that are saying you could actually build up inflation if you keep stimulating the economy. And that would mean higher interest rates. And in an economy where there's an enormous amount of domestic debt, not just government debt, but household debt, financial, non-financial debt, that debt can get very heavy very quickly if we should find ourselves in a period of sustained inflation. No one's saying it's going to happen right away, but so it's more that, as Susan was saying, as you move further down, it could become an issue.
It's almost like we've forgotten that inflation might exist. It's a long forgotten thought. Susan, we're going to go to you for the final question. You referenced earlier that Jagmeet Singh and the NDP are likely to support Justin Trudeau and the Liberals on this budget. So how do you? But at the same time, we're still in a minority parliament and kind of well past or coming to the average tenure of a minority government. How do you think this is going to play out in terms of a potential general election?
It's going to be, obviously the federal Liberals believe that this is going to be a fight on the left progressive side of the spectrum, that COVID has made Canada more, has tilted Canada leftward, more to the idea that government fixes your problems. That's a gamble. And the Conservatives are going to be betting that Canadians want a little more of a center-right approach to things. So the stage is set, but we are a long way away from an election.
That's interesting. That's fascinating. So we'll have to wait to see if that plays out. So listen, I want to thank Kevin, Trevin, and Susan. You've been a great contributors to this live event. I wish we could have been there in person, but hope to see you soon. Please stay safe, stay well.